The world was a symphony of muffled lies, and Julian Croft, a man who owned skylines, had chosen to experience it without sight. He sat on a park bench, the rough-hewn wood a grounding texture against the fine wool of his tailored suit, and listened. He heard the rustle of a newspaper, the crisp snap of the pages turned by a man feigning interest in stocks while actually watching a young woman jog by. He heard the strained cheerfulness in a mother's voice, a thin veneer over the exhaustion of chasing a toddler. He heard the city's distant, hungry roar. For 3 months, this had been his penance and his research. He donned the dark glasses, picked up the white-tipped cane, and stepped out of his gilded cage to find one person, just one, who wasn't playing a part. He was beginning to believe such a person didn't exist. Then he heard a new sound, soft as a moth's wing, the hesitant scuff of small, worn sneakers on the pavement. A tiny, deliberate inhalation of breath. A presence stood before him, radiating an energy so guileless it was like a beam of light in his self-imposed darkness. He felt a faint warmth and smelled the sweet, unassuming scent of lavender soap. "Excuse me, mister," a voice piped clear as a bell. "Are you okay?" Julian kept his face a mask of serene emptiness, tilting his head toward the sound. "I'm quite all right, thank you," he replied, his voice a practiced, gentle baritone. He heard another soft shuffle. "It's just... You look sad," the little voice continued, now closer. "My mommy says sad is like a rainy day inside your heart. You need some sunshine." Before he could respond, a delicate pressure graced his hand, the one resting on his knee. Small fingers, impossibly soft, carefully curled his own open and pressed a single, crinkled piece of paper into his palm. A dollar bill. He could feel its worn texture, the deep creases of a note that had been folded and unfolded many times. It was warm from her hand. "It's for you," she whispered, a conspiratorial tone in her voice. "It's my ice cream money, but I think your heart needs it more today." Julian's own heart, a tightly guarded vault of cynicism, gave a painful lurch. This was it, the impossible variable, an act of pure, unadulterated kindness. He was so stunned, so deeply moved, that he almost missed the other sound. A frantic, high-pitched yapping, growing louder with terrifying speed. A shriek from a woman farther down the path. "Winston, no, bad dog!" The yapping became a growl, as a blur of white fur, a terrier of some kind, its lead trailing behind it, shot across the grass directly toward the little girl. At the same instant, from the opposite direction, a cyclist, head down, music blasting from his earbuds, hurtled down the path, a silent, two-wheeled missile. The girl, startled by the dog, took a half-step back, directly into the cyclist's path. The collision was inevitable, a horrifying tableau about to play out in a split second. Time didn't slow down. It fractured. Julian's entire charade, his months of meticulous observation, his entire world-view, it all evaporated in a surge of pure, protective instinct. He didn't think. He reacted. With a speed that was utterly incongruous with his blind persona, he moved. The cane dropped with a clatter. His left arm shot out, not fumbling, but with surgical precision, catching the little girl's thin shoulder and pulling her back against his chest. His right leg extended, planting itself firmly in the cyclist's path. There was a grunt of surprise, the squeal of tires, and the clang of metal as the bike and rider went down in a heap. The little terrier, its charge interrupted, skidded to a halt and began barking maniacally at Julian's leg. The little girl in his arms was completely still, her head tilted back, her wide, sapphire blue eyes staring up at him. But she wasn't looking at his face. She was looking at his eyes. The dark, sleek sunglasses had been knocked askew in the sudden movement, and from behind the detached lens, his eye, sharp, focused, and vividly brown, was staring directly back into hers. A flicker of confusion crossed her face, a tiny furrow in her brow. In that moment, the world came rushing back to Julian in a torrent of unfiltered sight. The terrified cyclist scrambling to his feet, the flushed face of the dog's owner rushing toward them, the scattered leaves on the pavement, the vibrant green of the grass. And clearest of all, the crinkled dollar bill that had fluttered from his hand and now lay on the ground between them, a testament to a beautiful, shattered moment of truth. The blind man was gone, and in his place stood a billionaire, exposed by an act of selfless love and a moment of genuine fear. The ensuing chaos was a blur of apologies and frantic energy. The cyclist, a young man with more bravado than sense, dusted himself off, muttering about people not watching where they were going before realizing he had nearly flattened a small child. The dog's owner, a flustered woman in yoga pants, scooped up the yapping terrier, her face a mask of mortification. But Julian was oblivious to them. His entire universe had shrunk to the small, warm weight of the child in his arms and the piercing innocence of her gaze. He gently set her down, his hand steady on her shoulders, and straightened his sunglasses, the motion feeling like a lie he could no longer inhabit. The spell was broken. He was a fraud. Are you a superhero?" she asked, her voice a whisper of awe, her eyes still locked on his. The question was so unexpected, so pure, that it knocked the air from his lungs. He who had been called a titan, a shark, a visionary, had never been mistaken for a hero. He knelt down, bringing himself to her level, the expensive fabric of his trousers pressing into the gritty pavement without a second thought. "No," he said, his voice softer now, stripped of its practiced affectation. "No, I'm not." He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. She was maybe 7, with hair the color of pale corn silk, pulled back in a neat ponytail that had come slightly undone. Her face was a perfect oval, with a light dusting of freckles across the bridge of her nose. She wore a simple, clean but faded pink t-shirt and jeans, with a small patch on one knee shaped like a smiling strawberry. She was looking at him not with accusation, but with profound, startling curiosity. He saw the dollar bill on the ground and reached for it, his movements now fluid and certain. He picked it up and held it out to her. "I believe this is yours," he said gently. She shook her head, her ponytail swishing. "I gave it to you, for your heart reign." Julian's throat tightened. He had orchestrated hostile takeovers, dismantled corporations, and faced down the most ruthless negotiators in the world. But this small girl with her simple, devastating sincerity had disarmed him completely. My heart reign is gone now," he managed to say, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "You should have your ice cream." "Lily! Oh, thank heavens! Lily!" A woman's voice, sharp with panic, cut through the air. A young woman was running toward them, her face pale, her stride long and desperate. She had the same corn silk hair as the girl, though hers was tied up in a messy bun, and the same blue eyes, though hers were wide with fear. She knelt and swept the little girl, Lily, into a fierce hug. "I told you to wait right by the fountain. I was gone for 2 minutes. Are you hurt? What happened?" She looked up at Julian, her gaze sweeping over his immaculate suit, the now straightened sunglasses, and the discarded cane on the ground. Suspicion immediately clouded her features, a protective mother's instinct kicking in. "What's going on? Who are you?" Julian stood up slowly, feeling like an intruder. The role of the helpless blind man was easy. It invited pity, engendered trust, and kept everyone at a safe distance. This was different. He was just a man, a wealthy man in a park, who had just been involved in a chaotic incident with her daughter. There was a "A small accident," Julian said, his voice regaining its usual calm authority. "A dog and a cyclist. Your daughter is perfectly fine. I made sure of it." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. "She was with you?" Lily wriggled out of her mother's grasp. "He saved me, Mommy. He's a superhero. He moved like a flash of lightning." The woman looked from her daughter's shining face to Julian's impassive one. She saw the expensive suit, the confident posture, and then her eyes fell to the white cane lying forgotten on the ground. A deep line of confusion appeared between her brows. "I don't understand," she said, her voice wary. "Are you?" She gestured vaguely at the cane. Julian felt a flush of shame, hot and unfamiliar. The lie was a tangled net at his feet. He could try to reconstruct it, to claim he had some limited vision, to create a new fiction. But looking at Lily's trusting face, he couldn't. "The cane," he said, his voice even, "is not something I always require." It was a masterfully constructed evasion, technically true, but a lie of omission all the same. He hated himself for it. The woman, whose name he now knew was Sarah, seemed to accept this for the moment, her concern for her daughter overriding her suspicion. "Thank you," she said, the words clipped but sincere, "for helping her." She took Lily's hand, her grip firm. "We need to go, sweetie." "But Mommy?" "His dollar." Lily pointed to the bill still in Julian's hand. He held it out to Sarah. "Please. She wanted me to have it, but I can't accept it. She should have her treat." Sarah looked at the crinkled dollar, then back at Julian. He saw in her eyes a flicker of pride and a deep, weary sadness. He understood in that instant that accepting help, even a dollar returned, was a complicated thing for her. "Lily," she said softly, turning to her daughter, "when we give a gift from the heart, we don't take it back. That's what we talked about, remember?" Lily nodded solemnly. "Okay, Mommy." She turned her bright eyes back to Julian. "You keep it, for the next rainy day." And with that, they were gone, Sarah leading Lily by the hand, their figures retreating down the path until they were swallowed by the dappled afternoon light. Julian stood there for a long time, the chaos of the last few minutes fading into a profound silence. He was left with the forgotten cane at his feet and a single, warm, crumpled dollar bill in his hand. It felt heavier than all the billions in his name. He had come to the park seeking a single data point to confirm his cynical hypothesis about humanity, and had instead stumbled upon an anomaly that threatened to upend his entire equation. The game was over. The experiment was compromised. But a new, far more compelling question had just begun to form in his mind. Who was Lily? And what series of misfortunes had led to a world where a 7-year-old girl's greatest treasure was a single dollar bill, and her first instinct was to give it away? The walk back to the waiting limousine was different. The city he had been diligently ignoring for months assaulted his senses. He saw everything. The intricate web of cracks in the pavement, the iridescent sheen on a pigeon's neck, the exhaustion etched on the face of a hot dog vendor, the fleeting, joyful expression of a teenager reading a text message. It was all too much. A tidal wave of visual information he had intentionally dammed up. His driver, a stoic man named Thomas who had been with him for a decade, opened the door without a word, his face betraying no surprise at the sight of Julian walking without his cane, which he now carried awkwardly in his hand. Thomas had seen his employer through far stranger phases. Julian sank into the plush leather, the scent of which usually soothed him, but today it felt suffocating, artificial. "Take me to the office," Julian said, his voice flat, but as the car pulled silently into traffic, he looked down at the dollar bill in his hand. "Change of plans, Thomas. Stay here, I'll be back." Before his driver could respond, Julian was out of the car, his heart pounding with a strange, impulsive urgency. He had to find them. He couldn't let them just disappear. He walked back toward the park, his long strides eating up the pavement. He scanned the crowds, his eyes, so long accustomed to being hidden, now sharp and searching. He circled the fountain Lily's mother had mentioned, a grand marble structure with leaping dolphins. Nothing. He checked the playgrounds, the ice cream stand. It was a fool's errand. They could be anywhere. Dejected, he was about to turn back when he saw them. They were across the street waiting at a bus stop. Sarah was looking at her phone, her brow furrowed with worry, while Lily was tracing patterns on the dusty plexiglass of the shelter. Julian's instinct was to stride over there to say, "What?" To thank them again? To offer them money? The thought made him feel crude. He, who could buy and sell entire city blocks, had no currency for a transaction like this. So he did what he did best. He observed. He hung back, melting into the throng of pedestrians, and watched. The bus arrived with a hiss of air brakes. He saw Sarah's shoulders slump as she read the sign. Out of service. She spoke to the driver, her gestures growing more frantic. The driver shook his head, pointing down the street, and pulled away, leaving them in a cloud of diesel fumes. Julian saw Sarah rub her temples, a gesture of pure, unadulterated stress. She knelt down and spoke to Lily, her expression a careful mixture of reassurance and apology. Lily's face fell, her little shoulders drooping. Julian could guess the conversation. The next bus wouldn't be for an hour, or maybe it was the last one on that route for the day. He saw Sarah look at her watch, a cheap digital one, and her face tightened. She was late for something. A job, most likely. He watched as she took Lily's hand and they began to walk, not in the direction of a taxi stand, but deeper into a neighborhood of walk-up apartments and small, struggling businesses. Julian followed, keeping a safe distance. This felt wrong, invasive, a violation of their privacy. But the pull was irresistible. He had to understand. He tailed them for 10 blocks, a silent shadow in a bespoke suit. He felt a growing sense of dislocation. This was a part of the city he owned on paper but had never set foot in. Here, the glass towers of his world were replaced by brick facades stained with age and grime. The scent of expensive perfume was replaced by the smell of roasting nuts, exhaust fumes, and damp alleyways. He saw them turn into a narrow 4-story brownstone, its steps cracked and listing to one side. Sarah fumbled with her keys, cast one last weary look down the street, and then they were gone, the heavy wooden door closing behind them with a tired groan. Julian stood on the opposite side of the street, staring at the building. Apartment 3B, he guessed from the window they passed on the way up. It was a shabby, anonymous building, one of thousands in the city. But to him, it now felt like the center of the universe. He took out his phone, a sleek, custom-built device, and made a call. "Marcus," he said when his chief of staff answered, "I have a building address for you. I need to know everything. Owner, tenants, any outstanding complaints. Specifically, I need to know about the residents of apartment 3B, a woman named Sarah and her daughter, Lily. I want it yesterday." The professional in him had taken over, the ruthless seeker of information. But as he stood there, the crumpled dollar bill still clutched in his hand, he knew this wasn't about business. This was something else entirely. Something he hadn't felt in a very long time. It felt dangerously like hope. The information came back within the hour, as he knew it would. Marcus was ruthlessly efficient, a man who saw the world as a series of data points to be collected and collated. The report was concise and grim. The building was owned by a subsidiary of a larger real estate corporation, which, after 2 more steps up the chain, was owned by a holding company that was, of course, entirely owned by Julian Croft. He owned their home. The irony was so thick he could taste it. The building was slated for demolition in 6 months to make way for a luxury condo development, another jewel in his portfolio. The tenants had been offered a pittance of a relocation fee and were being systematically squeezed out through neglected repairs and sudden rent hikes. There were dozens of complaints filed with the city, all lost in a bureaucratic quagmire he had personally helped design. Then there was the file on Sarah Jensen, 31 years old. Widowed 2 years prior, her husband, a firefighter, had died in a warehouse fire. She worked 2 jobs, a day shift as a waitress at a diner in Midtown and an evening shift cleaning offices downtown. Her combined income was barely enough to cover the recently inflated rent. She had no family in the state. She and Lily were completely on their own. The report was a portrait of a woman hanging on by a thread, and Julian felt like he was the one holding the scissors. He sat in his penthouse apartment, a sterile expanse of glass and steel overlooking the city he ruled, and felt a profound sense of nausea. His little experiment, his quest for some abstract truth, had led him to this. He had been playing a game, and these were the lives of the people he was using as pawns. He looked at the dollar bill, which he had smoothed out and placed on his marble coffee table. It looked small and insignificant in the vast, empty room. Lily's ice cream money. He imagined her life. A life without the buffer of wealth, where a single dollar was a luxury, where a missed bus could trigger a cascade of disasters, where the walls of your home were owned by an invisible, faceless entity who saw you only as an obstacle to profit. His disguise had been a farce. He hadn't been seeing the world more clearly. He had been a tourist in the land of hardship, always knowing he could retreat to the safety of his limousine and his penthouse. He had felt their discomfort, but he hadn't understood their fear. Now he did. The fear of eviction, the fear of not being able to provide for your child, the fear of being utterly, terrifyingly alone. He called Marcus again. "Cancel the demolition on the East 34th Street property," he said, his voice cold and hard. "Immediately." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Sir, the permits are approved. The initial buyouts are—" "I don't care." Julian cut him off. "Kill it, and I want the holding company to sell that building, not to another developer, to a non-profit housing trust. I'll fund it myself. And I want the sale price to be $1. Marcus was too well trained to gasp, but Julian could hear the sharp intake of breath. $1, sir? You heard me. And another thing. I want you to go to a diner called the Morning Star on Lexington. You'll find a waitress there named Sarah Jensen. Give her this." He quickly dictated a message. Marcus was silent for a moment. "Sir, if I may, this is highly unorthodox. It could expose—" "Just do it, Marcus, and do it discreetly." He hung up the phone and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. The city lights twinkled below, a sea of diamonds. He had always seen it as a chessboard, a landscape of assets and liabilities. Now, for the first time, he saw it as a constellation of lives, each one a tiny, flickering light. And he had almost extinguished one of them. The next morning, Julian didn't put on his usual suit. He dressed in a simple pair of gray trousers, a plain black t-shirt, and a worn denim jacket he hadn't touched in years. He left the sunglasses and the cane behind. He took a taxi, the bumpy ride a stark contrast to the smooth glide of the limousine, and had it drop him off a block away from the Morning Star diner. He walked to the diner, his stomach churning with an unfamiliar mix of anxiety and purpose. The bell above the door chimed as he entered. It was a classic New York diner, a long formica counter with worn red vinyl stools, booths along the window, the air thick with the smell of coffee and frying bacon. And there she was. Sarah. She wore a pale blue uniform, her hair tied back in a practical ponytail. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of years of practice, balancing plates, refilling coffee cups. A small, tired smile fixed on her face. She didn't look up as he took a seat in a booth at the back. He picked up a menu, his hands feeling clammy. What was he doing here? This was insane. He was about to leave when she arrived at his table, a coffee pot in one hand, her order pad in the other. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice professional, impersonal. He looked up, and for a fleeting second, their eyes met. He saw a flicker of recognition, a slight widening of her eyes, before her professional mask slipped back into place. She knew him. He was the man from the park. "Yes, please," he said, his voice coming out huskier than he intended. She poured the coffee, her movements deft, not a drop spilled. "Know what you want?" He ordered a simple breakfast, pancakes and bacon, something he hadn't eaten in 20 years. He watched her as she moved through the diner, a small, weary planet orbiting a galaxy of demanding customers. He saw the way she smiled at an elderly couple, the gentle way she wiped a smudge off a little boy's cheek. He saw the resilience in the set of her shoulders, the deep-seated exhaustion in the faint shadows under her eyes. He was halfway through his meal when a man in a sharp suit entered the diner. Marcus, his chief of staff, looked profoundly out of place, an eagle in a sparrow's nest. He approached Sarah, spoke to her quietly, and handed her a thick envelope. Julian watched as she took it, her expression a mixture of confusion and suspicion. She opened it, and her face went pale. She read the note inside, her eyes scanning the page once, then twice. She looked up at Marcus, who simply nodded and then turned and left as discreetly as he had arrived. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, the envelope clutched in her hand. Then with trembling fingers she pulled out the contents. It was a cashier's check. Julian couldn't see the amount, but he knew what it was. $50,000. And there was a deed. The deed to her apartment. Apartment 3B was now hers, free and clear. The note, he knew, was simple. It said, "For the sunshine. From a friend." Sarah swayed on her feet, leaning against the counter for support. Another waitress rushed to her side, asking if she was okay. Sarah just shook her head, her eyes wide with disbelief. She sank onto a stool, staring at the papers in her hand as if they were written in a foreign language. Julian watched this all from the safety of his booth, a hidden god playing with the lives of mortals. A feeling of power, yes, but also a profound, aching emptiness. He had fixed her problem. He had thrown money at it, the way he always did. He had saved her from the consequences of his own actions. It was a neat, clean solution. So why did it feel so hollow? Why did it feel like cheating? He finished his coffee, left a $100 bill on the table, a gesture he immediately regretted for its crudeness, and walked out of the diner, the bell chiming his exit. He hadn't spoken another word to her. He had come here to connect, to understand. And instead, he had erected a new wall between them, a wall made of money. As he walked down the street, he realized his grand gesture hadn't brought him any closer to the feeling he'd had in the park when Lily had given him that dollar. That had been real. A simple, human connection. This was just a transaction. He had paid his debt, salved his conscience. But he hadn't fixed the real problem. He hadn't fixed himself. The next few days were a study in obsession. Julian had Marcus set up a discreet surveillance feed from a camera on a lamppost across the street from Sarah's building. It felt like a despicable violation of privacy, but he rationalized it as a necessary evil. He needed to know they were okay. He needed to see the effect of his intervention. He watched the feed on a massive screen in his home office, a silent, ghostly observer. He saw Sarah come home from work that first day, walking with a lighter step than he had ever seen. He saw her and Lily have a picnic dinner on the fire escape, something he imagined was a rare treat. He saw them laugh. He saw Lily dancing on the rooftop, her arms outstretched to the sky, a tiny silhouette of pure joy against the setting sun. His money had bought them a moment of peace, a reprieve from the crushing weight of their precarious existence. But it wasn't enough. He found himself learning the rhythms of their lives. He knew that Sarah left for her first job at 6:15 a.m. after walking Lily to a neighbor's apartment for the morning. He knew Lily went to the local public school, a grim-looking brick building a few blocks away. He knew Sarah returned between her jobs at 3:30 p.m. to pick Lily up and spend a precious 2 hours with her before heading out again to clean his offices. Another bitter irony. He saw the moments of tenderness, the fierce hugs at the school gate, the shared jokes on the front steps. He also saw the struggles that money couldn't immediately fix. He saw the old rattling air conditioner in their window finally give up with a puff of smoke during a heat wave. He saw Lily come home from school with a scraped knee, crying in her mother's arms. He saw Sarah sitting alone on the steps late one night after Lily was asleep, her face in her hands. She owned her apartment, yes, her immediate financial crisis was averted, but she was still a single mother working 2 demanding, low-wage jobs. She was still alone. The observation was no longer enough. He had to do more. But he couldn't be Julian Croft, the billionaire benefactor. That man was a symbol of an unequal world, a world that had almost crushed them. To approach them as himself would be to poison whatever genuine connection might be possible. He needed a new disguise, not a costume to hide in, but a role to learn from. He needed to be someone they could trust, someone who belonged in their world. He thought about the empty storefront on the ground floor of their building. According to Marcus's report, it had been a small neighborhood bookstore until the previous owner had retired a year ago. It had been sitting vacant ever since, another victim of the holding company's strategy of intentional neglect. An idea began to form. A plan so audacious, so far outside the realm of his normal operations, that it felt like a kind of madness. But it was a madness he welcomed. It was the first thing that had made him feel alive in years. He called Marcus. "I'm leasing the commercial space in the East 34th Street building," he said. "To whom, sir?" Marcus asked. "To me," Julian replied, "under a new name. And I'm going to need you to stock a bookstore. Old books, second-hand, nothing new. I want it to look like it's been there for 30 years. And Marcus, I'm going to need some different clothes." A week later, a new man moved into the neighborhood. His name was Jay. He looked a bit like that billionaire Julian Croft, but his face was softer, less severe, without the constant tension of a man who commanded empires. He wore faded jeans, soft flannel shirts, and sturdy work boots. He had a few days' worth of stubble on his chin, not meticulously trimmed, but simply there. He spent his days in the old storefront, which was now filled with the warm, dusty scent of old paper and binding glue. Carpenters, hired by Marcus, had installed floor-to-ceiling wooden shelves, a worn Persian rug covered the floor, and comfortable mismatched armchairs were tucked into cozy corners. Jay, or Julian, worked alongside them, not supervising, but actually working. He learned how to sand wood, how to apply varnish. He got calluses on his hands, a stark contrast to the manicured fingers of his former life. He unpacked boxes of books, thousands of them, sourced from estate sales and closing libraries. He ran his fingers over the cracked leather spines, inhaled the history from their pages. He was not just building a bookstore. He was building a new identity, one shelf at a time. He saw Sarah and Lily walk past the store every day. On the third day, Lily, her curiosity finally getting the better of her, pressed her face against the glass. Her small hands cupped around her eyes. Julian, who was arranging a collection of children's classics in the front window, looked up and smiled. He didn't say anything, just offered a small, friendly wave. Lily's eyes went wide, and she ducked behind her mother's legs. Sarah gave him a hesitant, questioning look, then pulled Lily along. The next day, Lily peered in the window again. This time, Julian was sitting in an armchair, reading a well-loved copy of The Little Prince. He looked up and gave her another small smile. This time, she didn't hide. She gave him a tiny, shy wave back before her mother gently tugged her away. On the 5th day, the bell above the door chimed. Julian's heart leaped into his throat. It was them. Lily was standing just inside the doorway, her mother a half step behind her hand resting protectively on her daughter's shoulder. "Hello," Julian said, his voice quiet, friendly. He put down his book and stood up. "Can I help you? We saw the lights on," Sarah said, her voice cautious. "We were wondering what was happening with the old shop." "I'm reopening it," Julian said with a genuine smile, the expression feeling more natural on his face than any he had worn in years. "An old-fashioned bookstore. It's been a dream of mine for a while." Lily's eyes were as round as saucers. She looked around at the towering shelves, the ladders leaning against them, the cozy chairs. "It's like a library," she whispered in awe. "But you can live here." Julian chuckled. "It does feel a bit like that sometimes. My name is Jay, by the way." He extended his hand to Sarah. She hesitated for a moment before taking it. Her hand was small, her grip surprisingly firm. "Sarah, and this is Lily. It's a pleasure to meet you both," he said. He then knelt down to Lily's level, the way he had in the park, but this time felt different. There were no lies between them. "I saw you looking at the books in the window, Lily. Do you like to read?" She nodded vigorously, her ponytail bouncing. "I love to read. Mommy reads to me every night. Right now we're reading about a girl who finds a secret garden." Julian's smile widened. "That's one of my favorites. You know, I have a very old copy of that book here. It has beautiful pictures inside." He walked over to a shelf, his movements unhurried, and pulled out a vintage edition of The Secret Garden, its cover illustrated with a lush, mysterious-looking garden. He handed it to Lily. She took it with a reverence usually reserved for holy texts, her small fingers tracing the embossed title. She opened it carefully, her eyes drinking in the colorful plates. Sarah watched them, a small, guarded smile on her face. Julian could see the wariness in her eyes, the natural caution of a woman who had learned that life rarely gives things away for free. He knew he had a long way to go to earn her trust. But as he watched Lily lose herself in the pages of the old book, the dusty afternoon light streaming through the shop window and illuminating the joy on her face, he felt a sense of rightness, of purpose that all his billions had never been able to buy. He wasn't a god in the heavens, rearranging lives with a phone call. He was just Jay, a man in a bookstore sharing a story with a little girl. And for the first time in a very long time, it was enough. The bookstore, which he named The Next Chapter, opened a week later. There was no grand opening, no ribbon cutting. Julian simply unlocked the door one morning, turned the sign to Open, and started a pot of coffee, the aroma mingling with the scent of old books. Business was slow at first. A few curious neighbors poked their heads in, bought a paperback or two. It didn't matter. Profit was not the objective. Presence was. His new life took on a simple, comforting rhythm. He would open the shop at 10, spend the day talking to the few customers who trickled in, recommend books, and read in the quiet moments. He saw Lily every day when Sarah walked her home from school. They would always stop at the window, and he would always wave. Soon, their waves became a daily ritual. Then one afternoon, Lily came in alone. Julian felt a jolt of alarm before he saw Sarah through the window, talking to a neighbor on the steps of their building, keeping a watchful eye. Lily walked straight to the children's section, a small corner he had set up with a tiny table and chairs and a colorful rug. She picked up the old copy of The Secret Garden and sat down, her small face a mask of concentration as she carefully turned the pages. She stayed for half an hour, completely silent, utterly absorbed. When Sarah came to the door to collect her, Lily looked up with a small, sad sigh. "Do I have to go?" "Yes, sweetie, we have to get your dinner started." "Can I come back tomorrow?" she asked, looking at Julian, her blue eyes full of hope. "You can come back any time you like," he said warmly. "This can be your secret garden, if you want." Her face lit up. From that day on, Lily became a permanent fixture in the bookstore. She would come in every day after school, do her homework at the little table, and then lose herself in a book until her mother came for her. Julian learned more about her in those quiet afternoons than any surveillance report could ever tell him. He learned she was fiercely intelligent, with a curious mind that devoured stories. He learned she had a mischievous sense of humor and a deep, empathetic heart. She would often ask him about the characters in the books, why they were sad, or what he thought they would do next. She called him Mr. J. He, in turn, began to see the world through her eyes. He saw the magic in the everyday, the grand adventures hidden in the pages of a book. She was slowly, patiently reteaching him how to be human. His interactions with Sarah were more tentative. She would come in to pick up Lily, always polite, always a little distant. She thanked him for letting Lily stay, for giving her a safe place to be while Sarah prepared for her evening shift. He learned to read the lines of fatigue around her eyes, to notice the days when her smile didn't quite reach them. He started leaving a cup of tea for her on the counter when she came in, a simple gesture of kindness. At first she seemed suspicious, but after a few days, she began to accept it with a small, grateful smile. They started to talk. Not about anything important at first. Just small talk about the weather, about a funny thing Lily had said that day. He learned about her life in fragments. He learned about her late husband, David, not from a report, but from the sad, proud way she spoke of his bravery. He learned about her dream of one day going to nursing school, a dream she had put on hold indefinitely. He never spoke about his own past. As far as Sarah and Lily knew, he was just Jay, a man who had tired of the corporate world and decided to open a bookstore. The lie was a constant, dull ache in his chest, but he told himself it was a necessary one. Julian Croft couldn't have these conversations. Julian Croft couldn't share a quiet cup of tea with a tired waitress. Only Jay could. One rainy Tuesday, the old building's plumbing finally gave out. Water began to pour from a pipe in the ceiling of the bookstore, right over the children's section. Julian rushed to move the books, but not before several were soaked. He was standing on a ladder, trying to patch the leak with duct tape, a temporary, futile gesture, when Sarah came in, an umbrella dripping onto the floor. "Oh my gosh, Jay, what happened?" she exclaimed, rushing forward. Lily, who was with her, let out a small gasp at the sight of the ruined books. "It's nothing," he grunted, wrestling with the pipe. "Just an old building showing its age." "Let me help," she said, taking off her coat. Before he could protest, she had grabbed a stack of dry towels from his small back room and was carefully drying the less damaged books. Lily, seeing her mother's example, picked up a cloth and began to meticulously wipe down the covers of the dry books on the bottom shelf. They worked together in silence for an hour, a strange, impromptu team. He eventually managed to slow the leak to a steady drip, a bucket placed underneath to catch the water. Sarah had salvaged what books she could, laying them out to dry on the counter. The shop was a mess, but as he looked at her, her hair damp and sticking to her forehead, her face smudged with dust, he felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the stuffy, humid air. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. I don't know what I would have done. She just shrugged, a small smile playing on her lips. We're neighbors. That's what neighbors do, right? That evening, after she had taken Lily upstairs, she came back down with 2 containers of homemade stew. I made too much, she said, a slight blush on her cheeks. I thought you might be hungry. They ate together, sitting at the little children's table, the sound of the rain and the steady drip, drip, drip of the leaky pipe the only sounds between them. And in that quiet, shared meal, surrounded by the comforting chaos of the bookstore, Julian felt the last of his carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. He wasn't Julian Croft, the billionaire. He wasn't even Jay, the bookstore owner. He was just a man, sharing a meal with a woman he was beginning to care for more than he was willing to admit, even to himself. The leaky pipe was a catalyst. The landlord, a faceless management company that Marcus had set up, was predictably slow to respond. Julian, as Jay, had to call them repeatedly, feigning frustration. It gave him an excuse to talk to Sarah more, to complain about their shared problem, to build a bond on the foundation of mutual annoyance. He hired a plumber himself, paid for, of course, from an account Marcus had set up for Jay, and had the pipes in the whole building repaired and replaced, a move that earned him the gratitude of every tenant. He was slowly becoming a part of the fabric of the building, of the neighborhood. He hosted a story hour for the neighborhood kids on Saturday mornings. Lily was his star pupil and unofficial assistant, helping the smaller children find their places. Sarah would often stay, sitting in one of the armchairs with a cup of coffee, watching him. He saw a new light in her eyes when she looked at him, a warmth that went beyond neighborly gratitude. He found himself looking forward to seeing her every day, his heart giving a small leap whenever the bell on the shop door chimed and she walked in. This feeling was terrifying. It was real, it was unscripted, and it was built on a foundation of lies. He was falling for her, and she was falling for Jay, a man who didn't exist. The guilt was a constant companion. What would happen when she found out? He knew he couldn't keep up the charade forever. The truth had a way of coming out, and when it did, it would destroy everything he had so carefully built. The crisis came sooner than he expected. One afternoon, a man in an expensive suit walked into the bookstore. Julian's blood ran cold. It wasn't Marcus. This man was a rival, a corporate raider named Richard Sterling, a man Julian had humiliated in a business deal years ago. Sterling was a vulture, and his presence in this neighborhood could mean only one thing. He had found a weakness. Sterling browsed the shelves, a predatory smile on his face. "Quaint," he said, running a dismissive finger over a leather-bound volume. "Never pictured you as the literary type, Croft." Julian's face remained impassive. "The name is Jay," he said, his voice low and steady. Lily, who was sitting at her table, looked up, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Oh, I'm sure it is," Sterling sneered. "Hiding out from the world? Or is this some sort of bizarre new tax shelter? I have to admit, I'm intrigued. When my sources told me Julian Croft was personally intervening to stop the East 34th Street development, and that the property was sold for $1, I had to see what was so special about this little corner of the world. And now I see. It's a woman." At that exact moment, the bell on the door chimed and Sarah walked in. She stopped short, her eyes taking in the scene. The man she knew as Jay, tense and cold, and the stranger in the expensive suit, radiating smug menace. Sterling's eyes lit up as he looked at Sarah. "Ah, and this must be the lucky lady. Tell me, my dear, do you have any idea who your humble shopkeeper really is?" Sarah looked at Julian, her face a canvas of confusion and dawning fear. "Jay? What is he talking about?" Julian's mind raced. He could deny it, throw Sterling out. But the damage was done. The lie had been exposed in the cruelest, most public way possible. He looked at Sarah, at the trust in her eyes beginning to curdle into betrayal. He looked at Lily, who was staring at him, her small face pale. He owed them the truth, not some twisted version from a man like Sterling. "Sarah," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "we need to talk." Sterling laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Oh, this is rich. I'll leave you two to it. Have fun explaining why you own the building you're pretending to rent in, Croft. It's been a pleasure." He turned and walked out, leaving a thick, poisonous silence in his wake. The world tilted on its axis. Sarah stared at him, her face ashen. The warmth in her eyes was gone, replaced by a glacial sheet of ice. "Own the building," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Croft? As in Julian Croft?" He could only nod, the movement feeling like a confession to a capital crime. He saw the cascade of realizations wash over her face. The man in the park, the sudden, miraculous check, the deed to her apartment, the new neighbor who had so perfectly filled a space in their lives. It was all a lie, a carefully orchestrated, monstrously deceptive lie. "You've been playing with us," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. "This whole time. The bookstore being my friend. Was this all some sick game for you? A little poverty tourism for the bored billionaire?" "No, Sarah, it wasn't like that," he pleaded, taking a step toward her. She flinched back as if he were carrying a disease. "Don't touch me," she hissed. "Don't you dare come near me or my daughter again." She grabbed Lily's hand. Lily was crying silently, tears tracking paths down her dusty cheeks. "Mommy, I don't understand," she whimpered. "Mr. J is Mr. Croft?" "Mr. J doesn't exist, sweetie," Sarah said, her voice breaking. She looked at Julian one last time, her eyes filled with a depth of contempt that pierced him to his very soul. "Stay away from us." She pulled Lily out of the store, the bell on the door chiming a final, mournful note. Julian was left alone, standing in the ruins of his carefully constructed world. The warm, comforting scent of old books now smelled like dust and decay. He had tried to fix a problem with money, and had failed. He had tried to fix it with a lie, and he had succeeded only in shattering the most precious thing he had ever found. The aftermath was a desolate silence. The bookstore, once his sanctuary, became a prison. Every book reminded him of a conversation with Lily. Every armchair held the ghost of Sarah's presence. The bell on the door remained silent. They didn't walk past the window anymore. He knew from his still active surveillance feed, a fact that now filled him with self-loathing, that they were using the back entrance to the building. He had become something to be avoided, a monster in their midst. He closed the shop. He couldn't bear to be in there, surrounded by the wreckage of his deceit. He retreated to his penthouse, back to the world of glass and steel, but the sterile quiet offered no comfort. He was haunted. He saw Lily's crying face every time he closed his eyes. He heard Sarah's whispered accusation, a sick game, echoing in the empty rooms. His life as Julian Croft felt more like a disguise than his life as Jay ever had. The suits felt like costumes, the business meetings like a tedious play he was forced to act in. He had tasted something real, and now this life of abstract wealth was flavorless, hollow. He tried to fix it the only way he knew how. He had Marcus draft a trust for Lily, a sum of money that would guarantee her education, her future, everything she could ever want. He had him draw up papers to give Sarah complete, undisputed ownership of the entire building, not just her apartment. It was a king's ransom, a grand apology written in dollars and cents. Marcus delivered the portfolio to her door. Julian watched on the monitor as she opened it, saw her face as she scanned the documents. Then, with a calm, deliberate slowness, she tore every single page in half, dropped the pieces back in the envelope, and left it outside her door. The message was clear. Her integrity was not for sale. His money was worthless here. It was the most profound rejection he had ever faced. He had been so arrogant. He had thought he could manipulate their lives for the better, that his wealth and power made him wise. He saw now that he was a fool, a clumsy giant who had stumbled into a delicate garden and crushed the flowers under his feet. He had to do something. Not as Julian Croft, the billionaire, and not as Jay, the liar. He had to approach them as himself, stripped of all artifice, and beg for forgiveness. It was the hardest thing he had ever had to do. He walked to their building, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He took the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the silent stairwell. He stood before the door to apartment 3B, his hand raised to knock, and hesitated. What if she slammed the door in his face? He deserved it. He deserved every bit of her anger. He took a deep breath and knocked. The silence stretched for an eternity. He was about to turn away when he heard the slide of the bolt. The door opened a crack. Sarah stood there, her face pale and drawn. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. I came to apologize," he said, the words feeling pitifully small. "What you did, it goes beyond an apology," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You didn't just lie to me, Julian. You orchestrated our lives. You made me believe in something, in someone, that was a complete fabrication. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is? How violating it feels?" "I know," he said, his own voice thick with emotion. "I know, and I am so sorry. It started as something else, an experiment. I was lost and cynical, and I was trying to find something real, and I found it, with you and Lily. But I was a coward. I was afraid to be myself, so I invented someone better. I never meant to hurt you." "But you did," she said simply. The door started to close. "Wait," he said, a note of desperation in his voice. "Please, just let me try to make it right. Not with money. I know that's not the answer. I don't want to lose you." He had said it. The truth, stripped bare. He wasn't just apologizing for a lie. He was begging for a future. The door stopped moving. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a deep, sorrowful conflict. Then he heard a small voice from inside the apartment. "Mommy? Is that Mr. J?" Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, a wave of pain washing over her face. She opened them again and looked at him. "His name is Julian, sweetie," she called back into the apartment, her voice strained. She looked back at him. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't trust you. I don't know how." The door closed, gently but firmly, in his face. The click of the bolt sliding home was the sound of finality. He stood there for a long time, the polished wood of the door reflecting his own empty, defeated image. He had lost. Julian didn't give up. He had lost battles before, in the boardroom and in the market, but he had always found a way to win the war. This was different. This wasn't about winning. It was about earning. He sold the bookstore. He couldn't bear to be Jay anymore, and he couldn't let the space remain a monument to his lies. He sold it to the city's library fund for $1 with the stipulation that it remain a community reading room managed by the tenants of the building. He endowed it with a fund that would keep it stocked with new books for the next century. It was an anonymous donation. Then, he did the hardest thing of all. He let go. He turned off the surveillance feed. He stopped trying to orchestrate their lives. He had to give Sarah the one thing he had stolen from her, her agency. He had to trust that she could make her own way, and he had to respect her decision to do it without him. He poured his energy back into his work, but with a new perspective. He started dismantling the more predatory aspects of his empire. He invested heavily in ethical projects, in affordable housing, in foundations that supported single parents and the children of fallen first responders. He was trying to become a man worthy of the forgiveness he so desperately craved. He was trying to become a man that Jay had only pretended to be. Months passed. The seasons changed. The ache in his chest never fully went away. He would walk past their street sometimes, a ghost in his own city, hoping for a glimpse of them, a sign that they were happy. He never saw them. He assumed they had moved on, that Sarah had used the security he had given her to build a new life, far away from him. He had accepted it as his penance. One crisp autumn afternoon, he was in the park, the same park where it had all begun. He wasn't in disguise. He was just Julian Croft, a man in a suit, sitting on a bench, watching the leaves fall. He heard a familiar sound, the scuff of small sneakers. He looked up and his heart stopped. It was Lily. She was older, taller, but it was unmistakably her. She was holding a book, and she was walking toward him, her expression serious and determined. She stopped in front of his bench. "Hello, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Hello, Lily," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He hadn't realized how much he had missed the sight of her. "My mom said you sit here sometimes," she said. "She said you might need a friend." He looked past her and saw Sarah standing by the fountain watching them. She gave him a small, hesitant nod. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was an opening. It was hope. Lily held out the book she was carrying. It was the old illustrated copy of The Secret Garden from the bookstore. "We saved this," she said. "Mommy said it was a gift from a friend. And you don't take back gifts from friends, even if they make a big mistake." She climbed onto the bench next to him, her small legs dangling far above the ground. She opened the book to the first page. "Will you read it to me?" she asked. "Mommy says my reading is getting good, but I like the way you do the voices." Julian looked at her bright, hopeful, impossibly forgiving face. He looked over at Sarah, who had taken a few steps closer, a tentative smile on her lips. He felt the sting of tears in his eyes, the first he had shed since he was a boy. He took the book, its familiar weight a comfort in his trembling hands. He cleared his throat and began to read, his voice filling the quiet air. He read about a locked garden and a lonely girl, about secrets and redemption, about how broken things can be mended and dead things can be brought back to life. And as he read, he knew this wasn't just a story anymore. It was a promise. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one built not on lies or money, but on the simple, powerful truth of a shared story, a rainy day in a bookstore, and the enduring sunshine of a little girl's love. The journey ahead would be long. Trust, once shattered, is a difficult thing to rebuild. But for the first time, Julian Croft felt the genuine, unshakable belief that some things, the most important things, were worth more than any fortune. Family, forgiveness, and a second chance. These were the treasures he would spend the rest of his life earning, one page, one day at a time.